And then came Game 10. On December 6th, 2017, we received the first 10 games published between the 100-game match that went down between the Google-acquired company DeepMind and their own AlphaZero and the world's strongest open-source engine, that being Stockfish. Your mama told you to save the best for last, and if that's what you're expecting here in our fifth and final video of this series, then we hope that you're going to get it. A super instructive and interestingly dynamic attack that went down, but don't take my word for it. Let's let the moves do the talking. After knight f3, knight f6, and d4, we see a transposition back into what has been repeated in almost every game that AlphaZero had white, and that was the Queen's Indian, besides the lone French we had in Game 9. And after b6, g3, we see Stockfish sticking with the approach that he adjusted to in Game 5 and repeated in Game 8, that of course being bishop to b7, rather than the move bishop a6 that was played by Stockfish in Game 3. After bishop b7, bishop g2, here we see bishop e7. For those of you who have followed the entire video series, and if you haven't, by the way, check out all the videos in our Twitch video library or, of course, on YouTube or Chess.com, wherever you want to find it. But we also saw bishop b4 check played in one game by Stockfish. Here, the open source beast decides to go back to the classical development of bishop e7. And after castles, we see white employing once again the positional pawn sacrifice that has been used several times by AlphaZero. He likes himself a positional pawn sacrifice, apparently. The point of d5, everybody, is that after e takes d5, knight h4, again, we see the idea repeated that white is using the diagonal to expose a pin against the b7 bishop. And if black doesn't play the move that he has played every time in this position, c6, you have to guard the pawn, white would simply win back the pawn for free and then grab a massive space advantage. Not something black can deal with, especially with the dominant knight coming into f5, hitting the dark squared bishop. So, not that we need to explain it any more than we already did in Game 5. That's why black has to play c6. And after we capture d5 and play the move knight f5, obviously we are not interested in letting black take and double the h4 pawns. The knight comes back to c7, and once again, e4 is played, and we are back in the exact position we had previously. Now, in that game, black played the move bishop f6, that being Stockfish. And we talked a lot about white's different options, specifically around trying to make sure that white gets very decent control over the d-file, trying to make sure that those squares are gripped for long-term compensation on the dark squares specifically. But there were also some lines that occurred, for example, in the Tregubov game that I quoted after rook e1, d5, e5, and then bishop c8, trading off the knight for the dark squared bishop this way. So a similar, though not that exact line, type of compensation was achieved by AlphaZero in that he gave up 2 pawns for a long-term form of compensation on the dark squares, specifically related to the dominance of this d6 square. So I wonder, I'm talking about this because I wonder how much Stockfish is learning from his previous experience of AlphaZero, maybe doing a little organic machine intelligence of his own, or if it's just a matter of wanting to mix it up. But here Stockfish plays the other main line, which is not bishop f6, that of course being d5. Black is willing to give up the dark squared bishop immediately to avoid any type of long-term weaknesses achieved on the d-file. And before we think that, okay, now the d5 is played, you think the most common ways to deal with this break would be the approach from AlphaZero, those moves being things like knight c3. Usually white doesn't want to take here because you want to increase your pressure so that after bishop f6 and you take it, you can leave black strapped with an isolated pawn. As long as you have another piece hitting d5, if black did take with a knight, again, you'd be able to take it. And you, as we said, leaving black strapped with this isolated pawn. There are even some lines that go with white immediately coming back with the knight e3 and trying to grab the pawn this way, where after knight to c5, some of these variations are simplified very quickly and reach a very, very equal ending. So this is one way that white has played previously. Rook e1 is also a move that, again, builds on the tension, maybe bluffs at the idea of e5. We can even get a transposition to the Tregubov game I quoted if you're paying attention. But either way, those types of build on the tension, not release it, are the things we've seen be the most common approaches here. But AlphaZero doesn't want it. AlphaZero plays e takes d5, immediately letting black take back with the knight, which of course Stockfish does, because that's the whole point. If black doesn't have to take with the pawn and isolate said d-pawn, why do it? Why not take with the knight? Well, that's what Stockfish thinks and agrees with that assessment. And after knight to c3, we see that now we're getting even further into roads that have still been played. I think there were a couple of games in the database, but not nearly as much as the other lines where white builds on the tension and tries to play against the isolated pawn. In this position after knight to c3, Stockfish surprises with the move knight takes c3. And I say surprises because it's the move that allows the next series of forcing ideas by white to come. Maybe I'm just saying that because you think after Stockfish getting it handed to him a few times, he'd have some human fear. Now I remember he's not human. The other line I analyzed, probably the more solid approach by black, is indeed bishop f6 and allowing isolated queen pawn positions to be reached. Maybe call AlphaZero's bluff, where the best line is probably just to go for knight e3 and transpose into the line I said that just simplifies. So to me, bishop f6, I'd be curious what AlphaZero might have come up with if it's not just this big simplification. Maybe knight e4, maybe something else to maintain the tension, but the world will never know, kind of like the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop, because Stockfish played knight takes c3, and here's where things get fun. If you haven't paused the video, or if you don't have all the refreshments you need for the rest of the time, that's a you problem. We're going to move forward. Queen to g4. I'm not taking back on c3 and letting you trade queens. I'm gaining a tempo on g7 and immediately saying that pieces will come to the king side whether you like it or not. After g6, knight h6 check, king g7, and take c3, we see that white is getting compensation for the pawn in a way that is not exactly like the previous games we've seen that were focused around the backward d pawn, the pressure, on the d file, the d6 square, but still centered around the king side. And that seems to be a common theme of all of these Queen's Indian d pawn sacks, that yes, white's down a pawn here. You can count again the pieces on the board if you don't believe my math, but we're dealing with lack of development on the queen side. And when you have lack of development combined with your opponent having a lot of pieces on the squares that they want to be on, you're always in a human predicament where humans really get afraid of those positions, right? No one likes having their king come under fire. So we're assessing that AlphaZero's practical approach and belief that long-term activity will make up for the pawn. That's clearly what AlphaZero is saying is the right approach against Stockfish. Not that any of us can repeat it, but it is an interesting takeaway. After bishop to c8, queen f4, queen to d6, and then the queen moves, the move g5 comes in. And as you can see, Stockfish likes his position. That evaluation bar to the left says, well, I think I'm kind of trapping your knight, which is why I was willing to do that. I'm not sure how much compensation you'd get if you let me have it, but if you back up the knight, I'm going to gain yet another tempo, followed by another aggressive move, and suddenly it may be black who's getting an attack on the king side. Don't forget the second player is up a pawn. So g5 was played, and this was the position that first really shocked the world when reviewing these games, because I think knight g4 would be the move that any human would plan to play here. And again, Stockfish been thinking for a while now, our engine on Chess.com, still thinks knight g4 is the best move, still thinks that's what black should be expecting. But no, AlphaZero plays rook to e1, just giving up the pony, saying, I'm playing for a long-term piece sacrifice. That's right, long-term and piece sacrifice used together, no longer oxymorons. And I'm pointing out that your development on the queen side leaves something to be desired, as it did in previous games. And after king takes h6, I'm playing a move h4, building up on the attack slowly. I'm not going for anything super aggressive. By the way, moves like check here just don't quite work, as now you can't afford to take e7 in a mizzo because I get the queen first. And if you take g5, black will trade and then play queen to g6, pretty much defending everything. So nothing really to expect with queen checks. Rook takes e7 also would just be a big way to trade, which shouldn't be something that you're into if you're already down a piece. So yes, h4 makes sense, but it is kind of interesting to see that it's, again, just building up long-term, saying, I believe that black's dysfunction will be so hard to deal with, I don't need to be in a rush. I can bring more pieces into it. f6 is played. I did some analysis of king to g7 just to show how potentially dangerous the attack might be for all of you. White would have taken on g5, and after bishop f5, the key point is that bishop f4 and avoid the queen trade gets followed by queen e5, which is a double attack and a fork on the two bishops. White is going to go on to have a very, very strong initiative and maybe even win back some material right away. So that's one reason why black chose to play f6. Now after bishop e3, bishop f5, we get the rook over. Again, we see the black attempt to try to get the queens off the board. Not interested, of course, especially given that we're down a piece. We need to get something against the king. And after b5 takes g5, queen h4 check, and king g6, we see the next truly brilliant move that flips the, even for Stockfish, evaluation on its head and shows exactly what AlphaZero was intending the whole time. Plays queen to h1. Putting the queen back on the first rank like he's Anatoly Karpov, and saying that even here, with my pieces retreating, your development on the queen side lacks so much, and there's still so much to be desired there that I'm really not in a rush. What I find even more fascinating about queen h1 is not even the patience it shows, but the follow-ups that come with it, the key ideas, and I'm going to try to show you some of the lines I've analyzed. King g7 was played in the game. But I'm going to show you what happens on h5, as that is initially the first move that Stockfish likes. You can see the evaluation going, liking black, and it seems to be good. But one really fascinating idea that we found is that white is consistently just offering a trade, just trading pieces to open up lines. And after queen takes a2, bishop to d4. Again, just bringing more pieces into the attack and saying that despite all of the material here, now you start to see even Stockfish liking white. Note that there is no development of this knight, which means there's no development of the rook. The knight can't come to d7 because if bishop takes f5, followed by queen takes c6 check, and everybody falls. If the knight goes to a6, then similar things happen with bishop takes f5. So yeah, in hindsight, we all see that, wow, yeah, it really is hard for black to coordinate. But going for the sack initially just seems so risky. After knight to d7, okay, we have exactly what I said, take f5, but the main move I analyzed, not the bad move, knight d7, but bishop d6, and this is where things get really, really fun. This shows you just the depth of this sacrifice. White was intending g4, exclam, forcing the opening of the h-file, followed by, brace yourself, bishop to f6, exclama viach, boomtown. Look at every piece is hanging. Black can't take anything without getting mated. If you take f6, we take f5. By the way, king takes allows queen e4 checkmate. Rook takes allows rook takes d6, followed by everybody entering with gusto. Of course, retreating the king would allow immediate moves like queen h7. The queen is just infiltrating the h-file, and the game is over. So this highlight here, I spent a lot of time on this position, I'll be honest with you. I've probably spent more time analyzing these games than is considered healthy for any human being, neglecting my email inbox as we speak, because I had to know the truth. What's going on here? This one I even analyzed with Komodo, and it takes Komodo a while to come up with white's long-term compensation. But once they do, you see g4, you see the pieces open up and come to life, and you see exactly why black is in so much trouble. So in the game, Stockfish sees as much of this as he did and plays king g7. All noted now as really needed because he's getting the king off of the 6th rank where all those tactics were occurring, preventing the knight from getting developed. So as far as us understanding why these moves were played, that's kind of the goal, and I think we are. Bishop to e4 comes anyway. Again, just a really simple, straightforward approach. I'm going to trade pieces to open up lines of attack. Bishop to g6. Takes on g6 and then queen h3 shows again the difficulties that black continues to have. Even with pieces coming off the board, I'm keeping such a strong eye on the d7 squared that this knight remains crippled, whether it's because the queen will come in, the rook will come in, too many potential threats for black to have the time to develop the queen side. That's the whole point. Bishop f6, king to g2. Now we're switching over to the h-file. A lot of people had analysis. Here Stockfish took a2, and we're going to see that the attack really gets going for AlphaZero now because of the h-file. But I wanted to prove that probably this position is already beyond saving anyway, even if rook h8 was played. Here's why. The queen comes into e6. Actually, no, that was the line I analyzed that's not as good. I'll show you. With queen e6, there's actually a line that goes into the endgame. It goes like this. Queen f8, rook d6, queen f7, forcing a queen trade. And the combination that I analyzed with Komodo was that a big trade here, followed by bishop d4 check, would win the rook. But likely the result here would be a draw. Maybe even black is the only one who can win, despite the double g-pawns, due to the healthy 3-on-2 on the queen side. So that was the first line I analyzed, but actually queen e6 is not needed. White doesn't need to be that forcing. And the simple queen to g4 is enough for white's attack to still be just devastating for black. The knight still can't develop because the rook comes to d7, and simple moves coming, whether it's bishop d4, bishop takes g5, and black's position is not really savable. I'll show you one line we analyzed, which is queen f8 takes on g5, rook h5, f4, bishop takes, pawn takes, c5 would allow queen e4, and again, you're looking at positions where there's just okay, I guess if you don't play c5 and queen e4, the threats are things like rook e6 and rook d6, and there's no way to guard the infiltration of the g6 pawn. We'll come back to the reasons why moves like queen to f7 trying to come in on this diagonal are no good because of the brilliant idea that AlphaZero found in the game. I don't want to spoil that for you, so I'm not going to show you now, but we can see that with the opening files and simple moves, white is going to maintain a strong attack even if black had played rook h8. That's the proof in the pudding we were trying to find with that line. So after king to g2, again, rook h8 wasn't played, queen takes a2 was. Rook h1, the queen comes back to g8, and this is the last moment where we see AlphaZero's full picture brilliance come to the table. If you haven't seen this game, maybe pause your video and think about how white can improve on the attacking chances without allowing potential counterplay against your own king, because you need more pieces in order to open up all the necessary lines that it'll take to get at this king, but how to do it without opening counterplay. That's what AlphaZero found here. And when I first saw this move, I was like, why? That seems like a weird computer move. And then I was like, oh, that's why. And that move was c4. I love this move because exactly the first question is, why is that needed? What's the point? Well, the first thing it points out is that it's very crucial that the queen cannot capture because queen h7 is mate. If the queen could capture, c4 would be just a useless computer move where you're like, WTF, why the face? But there's no c4 if the queen can take it. The queen can't take it because of mate. So what's the point in inducing the pawn to come to c4? The whole point is that in every line after b takes c4, suddenly f4 is a possibility where it never was, because now there's no longer a queen a2 check. White has literally closed down the highway with black's own pawn, allowing white to be super aggressive with the threat of f takes g5, and black has no counterplay. The line we looked at was if takes, queen h6 check, king f7 followed by queen takes here. Again, if the knight moves, rook d7 is coming. After queen to g7, queen takes c4 check, bishop to c5. I don't even need to go on. You see the evaluation bar flipping. There's queen e6 check. There's rook e1 check coming. Black is simply busted. So again, none of that happens without this amazing idea of f4, and it's exactly what forced Stockfish to see the writing on the wall. Suddenly, black goes into panic mode where it wasn't before. In fact, even here you see he still likes black, but very soon after rook to e8, we're going to see that white's attack becomes overwhelming, and even Stockfish knows it. Bishop to d4, making another trade, not because we're happy to trade pieces up a piece, but because elimination of defenders is the key way to break down black's obstacles. Takes d4, rook d8, trying to close the d-file. After trade and queen e6, though, we'll see that now the lack of pieces, you've basically cut the board in half. Yes, white has been playing down a piece this whole time, but really white is playing up an entire rook as far as evaluating who's threatening what. The idea of queen e5 check followed by rook h7 is mate, which is what forces knight to d7 finally to be played. But with the rook coming to d1, white is going to win not just back the knight, but with it even more material. That's what forces knight c5. The point is that if black allows rook takes d7, as we said, it's not just the knight, it's 7th rank mate, which is why black had to go for the endgame down the exchange. White simply trades, starts picking up all the pawns that he can. Emphasizing king activity, though. Again, AlphaZero just having good Russian schoolboy technique all around, never falling for any traps. Of course, Stockfish trying to set a few more, like forking the king and rook. AlphaZero not interested, going to make the right choices to solidify tactics before gobbling up all the queenside pawns. And when he does, black will simply throw in the towel. And that's what happened here. After king to d4, now the threat of rook takes b5 is unstoppable. Again, one last reminder, you couldn't take it because the knight would fork the king and rook. But after king d4, Stockfish just resigned. So back to that final critical moment where the knight did come to d7. I just want to make sure that we've proven to everybody exactly why there was nothing better than knight to c5. Again, no queen move will avoid taking. And by the way, no reason for white to try to keep the attack going when you can just convert into an endgame. I found that, again, just very human characteristics, very straightforward approach from AlphaZero, simplifying as soon as he could. No point in doing this, even if you win the knight on c5, because as soon as black is able to kind of bring more pieces into the position, even if pawns fall with check, you're just happy that you're black. You've been able to stop the mating net, and probably you're going to draw this queen and pawn ending. That's exactly why AlphaZero made the right decision to go into the endgame up the exchange. So, all right, well, that brings our entire video series breakdown of the AlphaZero match versus Stockfish to a close. We hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning in to all of our breakdowns. If you want to see a quick highlight, maybe this is the only video you've tuned into and you're not exactly sure that you have time to watch all the other 15 to 20 minute breakdowns, head over to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Daniel Rensch. Please follow me over there and see a faster breakdown of just the highlights, the real critical moments that took place in this match, the key positions, not entire game reviews. Either way, I appreciate everybody tuning into this series. Thanks for supporting the chess community, and we'll see you around on Chess.com.